Hey, it's great to be here. I was always very surprised to see Matthew here on time. And number 10, he was always late for every meeting, as far as I can remember. And then sit on the windowsill and, after 20 minutes, make some blisteringly brilliant comment, which we'd realized was completely impractical nonetheless. And then he'd disappear again. But we were all very much richer for it. Yeah, it was great to be here, actually, and talk about this. It's a little different from my day job in the Institute. It's got a lot more policy content, but it does have a lot of things which I've thought about, I guess, over the last few years, try to pull together in an argument. So what I thought I'd try and do today is cover fairly briskly these sort of things, revisit the sort of happiness agenda, which we certainly did some work on in government, and I did before that, but that sort of is a starting point for some of these discussions. But then actually I want to look about more our kind of changing values and fears, both in the UK and more broadly. I'm going to touch on the issue of inequality and how this affects the story of hidden wealth in a darker way, and then talk about some policy implications. And actually, I thought I'd try and leave with some maybe implications for you might want to, as opposed to just things that government might do. I thought I'd use just a kind of prelude is Matthew's lecture, actually his annual lecture this year, and about, and to pick up on some of the discussions that he's been pushing in the last few years. You may remember, for those of you here, I actually watched it online, but he had this man on the elephant thing, which is, if any of you at Matthew's lecture, annual lecture? There's at least 3 of you, including Matthew. All right, anyway, he used this metaphor, which is bringing together a number of issues about, the man on the elephant. The elephant is the kind of your underlying kind of behavioral and cognitive responses that sort of you can't change often. And then the man is your kind of conscious self trying to nudge it along. And then the trees where there's sort of the environment that you're kind of working your way through. And his kind of challenge was, to what extent can democracy, as a way of sort of pandering to our biases, can actually help us think past them in terms of possible futures and how the world will be. And obviously this is partly what I'm trying to talk about in this book and this work. We also had, of course, a respondent from, who was a bit more critical, those of you who know him, who basically said, well, actually, these underlying effects, particularly the behavior ones, are unstable, and it's all too complex to actually apply any of this stuff. So again, I'll try and draw out maybe some applications as I go along the way. But in terms of the metaphor, I guess a lot of my story today is about not just the individual elephant, it's about what happens when you get a herd of elephants. So it's, as Will Hutton might have said, the herd we're in is partly the story, about how these elephants bump along and create kinds of pathways through this forest. Which we might not have chosen ourselves, but not necessarily certainly chosen through a democratic method, but nonetheless have these very distinctive pathways. And once you're on them as a society, actually it's quite difficult to see the other pathway you might have been on or might get to. Okay, so let me start with the happiness stuff. Now, obviously it's become quite a big deal now, but a few years ago it was much less well trodden. I won't go through all of that. But it does form a bit of a background about what is it we're trying to achieve in policy. So for many policymakers, the dominant sort of model is an economic one. It's about money. We can introduce a little bit of democratic stuff alongside. Actually, Matthew, this is a picture from when we did our deliberative poll at number 10 in March 2007, or whatever it was. So money is a very dominant issue, but there are clearly alternatives, and that's partly why the wellbeing agenda comes in. So this book and this story today is a bit about that, and clearly partly rooted in my own experience in government and so on. By the way, I just mentioned the Options for Britain is also something which came out last summer, which was an update of that earlier Options book, and provides some background in terms of the wider policy space, which I won't go through today. So what's the headline story? Well, it's pretty obvious. This is world GDP per capita in the last 100-odd years, and sure, yes, we're definitely richer. So we've got, electricity is cheaper, and we can travel further and do all kinds of things and produce food more efficiently. And we also know that richer nations are much happier. So this is lots of ways of presenting it. This just shows it by GDP, and the circles are the size of different countries. And there, of course, you can just see the UK, kind of where you'd expect us to be. You might notice, for example, Denmark, I'll come back to them, similar levels of wealth, but actually appear to be much happier. than us. Is that real, is it not? Well, let's see. So there's the UK, just to help you position it. On the other hand, though, despite that very strong relationship, and there's a correlation of better than 0.8 normally, when we look over time in a country like the UK or elsewhere, we see this remarkable lack of a relationship. So 30, 40 years of growth in the UK context, and yet there's the life satisfaction line pretty much flatlining. So how can it be that cross countries this relationship is so strong, and yet within countries it's so weak? It's got a name named after, in fact, this bloke, Easterlin, Richard Easterlin. The Easterlin paradox, how can it be that, as I said, within countries the relationship is so weak, even though between it's so strong? I guess, in a nutshell, my argument about why this happens is partly to do with this hidden wealth stuff. There are a whole load of characteristics in societies which actually drive independently both growth, economic growth rates, and actually our well-being. So one of the reasons, in a nutshell, for example, Scandinavian countries end up being quite efficient, effective economies is because they've got high levels of trust and they have low transaction costs and so on. And this both makes them happier, broadly speaking, and it also drives their relative economic growth rates. Okay, and we can actually see that in some models also within countries, within country regions. If you want to try and bring together the 20 years of research around well-being broadly within a kind of single slide, I'm going to try and do it. It's a Danish formula. So I showed you on the earlier graph, the Danes are very happy, and in fact they've been getting even happier over the last 20, 30 years. Now what happens if you ask people, what do you think is your formula? What is it that drives happiness? And so let's ask the Danes. They're very happy, right? And this is what you get. I've ranked these responses according to the Danish answers, as it were. So you can see right at the top there, they say love. Now, that's slightly cheesy, but it turns out to be they're the only European country that has that as their top-ranked answer, actually. And you can sort of see the kind of things that they rank. Now, let's just compare that for a minute to the UK. What do we say when we say, what makes you happy? Remember, we're not as happy, of course. And you can start to see some differences. Right, so there you go. I'll just pick up some obvious ones. We can see, love, that's not so important. No, we don't care so much about that. Freedom, no, that's not so important to us. Solidarity, etc. Whereas you can see the obvious peaks above are money, for example. There you go. This is what your grandmother told you, and it turns out to be true. And just to drive home the point, let's have a look at the least happy Europeans. Those who don't know, they are the Bulgarians. And this is their answer, okay? So love, we really don't care very much about that, but you can see the things that matter are money, absolutely, work, you might say, well, they want more of it, whatever. Freedom, solidarity, no, I don't care much about that at all. All right, so in a nutshell, as it were, just asking these populations, it gives you a sense more or less of that's what the aggregated results of many more detailed studies of life satisfaction tell you. And it is, in some sense, I guess I'm giving you clues about this aspect of hidden wealth in a nation. Right. Now let me jump to a slightly different story, which is this, about our changing values and fears. And to go back to the earlier metaphor, this is partly a story about the pathways that we get on as societies. And also then to reflect on, well, what are we on? What is the kind of pathway we've got locked onto? And I'll tell you some of the results which I thought were quite surprising going back to the underlying value data, which I hadn't had the opportunity to look at for a while since I was in government. For those who haven't seen these, this is a value map. This one actually based on the work particularly of a guy called Ronald Inglehart. And so this is, you ask lots, thousands of people in literally hundreds of countries nowadays, and you look at, is there any patterns in their underlying values? You sort of mash it all together. And this is an attempt basically to do that over a very large number of different variables. And you find these, in this case, two dominant underlying axes. And it turns out that countries group in quite interesting and recognizable ways. The two axes, incidentally, are, on the one hand, the bottom, we have this difference between survival values. In other words, I've just got to get enough food, I've got to manage, got to get some work and just make it through, versus self-expression values. And on the other axis, what's called often traditional versus secular rational. So the traditional is often a bit kind of, you might think of traditional religions, but it's also kind of traditions and customs, as opposed to more rational world view. Economic growth, there's the UK, by the way, you can just see. We're in this English-speaking bubble over here. We're quite into self-expression values, but we're actually kind of middle of the road in terms of our traditional versus secular. And what happens is economic growth over, we know this because we've got 20, 30 years of data, pull countries in this sort of general direction. But the interesting thing we already knew was that the countries didn't seem to all get pulled into the same space. Right? So they stay sort of in these relatively distinctive value clusters over time. So that, as it were, is a kind of value map, gives you some of the background context. And just a quick aside on this, often interested around religion, just gives you an illustration of the power. If you ask somebody who is a Muslim or a Christian or whatever in India versus the US or something, and you say, what's more important to their values overall in such a map, it is absolutely the nation. It is not the religion, actually. It's one of the powerful, the national stuff seems to do the heavy lifting. So how do these things change over time? Well, again, one of the things that Engelhardt found is that many of these values were quite stable, but they were rooted in the fact that people more or less kept a lot of their values over the lifetime. Now, there are some that do change over the lifetime too, and all populations move, but he particularly got very interested in what he called Postmaterialism, which is a sort of trade-off value. And what you'd find is that each generation, each line here is a generation, and they tend to keep, or we tend to keep our values. So different forces like economic shocks make us all bounce up and down, but what happens is as older generations die off, in this case, the younger generations were more so-called post-materialist, which is a slightly misleading term, but, and that's how you get your value shift within countries. So there, for example, is my parents' generation would be along there, and there would be me on this thing. So what does this mean in practical terms? If I go and see my parents, you may identify with this, I don't know, and there's a moldy piece of fruit, right? They'll cut off that bit of fruit, and they'll say, it's perfectly good apple, right? You can eat the rest of it. Whereas my generation would be like, you chuck it in the bin. Because my kids would just take the whole bag and chuck it in the bin. So are we post-materialists? Well, actually, the thing is we're not really quite post-materialists as it happens, because we just expect to have all those kind of material things, and we expect our lives to be interesting, and our jobs to be interesting, and so on, and to do socially good things too. Anyway, that's the broad story of social, kind of an aspect of value change. But where's the UK in all this? Well, when we look pollster-type stuff, we tend to use graphs like this. Look at what are the predominant public concerns. And they've clearly changed a lot, unlike some of the underlying value patterns. So this is 35-odd years of data. You can see in the 70s we worry about inflation, may come again. Unemployment, of course, by the time that Blair comes along for the 97 election, you can see the dominance of public service issues, education and health and so on. Still there in 01 and fading away by 205 in a more complex mesh. And today, of course, the economy is shooting back up, and crime, very important. I mean, actually, crime, very important, as I'll show you. So one of the patterns, actually, about the UK, when you look at some of this stuff, is that, in a nutshell, Britons are unusually afraid of other people. And I think it's very striking. This graph just shows you, sorry, there are a few graphs here, you'll have noticed, is the bars of the UK, and this is compared us to the EU 15, our European neighbours. What are they most concerned about? And this is just before credit crunch, right? So this is just before credit crunch, to give you a sense of it. Obviously, economy's a bit more prominent now. But look at those kind of main lines where we're way above others. Can you see that? So these ones and these ones. So that's crime there and immigration, and then also terrorism, and then just getting in there, number 4 is the healthcare system. Right? So actually it's a kind of an unusual bundle, actually, of those top 3 concerns. Very few other European countries had anything like it. So you might say, we're afraid of other people. Are we right to be? Well, not entirely rational. Here's something, for example, from the International Crime Victimization Survey, and it shows change from 92 to 205. The blue lines, again, are a bundle of other countries in the International Crime Victimization Survey, and the red line, or the mauve line, is the UK. And you can see that the reduction in crime is less pronounced in the UK than in many other countries, although most categories still fall in. The line at the top, by the way, is motorbikes. For some reason, we like stealing bikes now. But when you look at these fears, so this is just a particular example. There's a few others in the book. Do you think you're going to be burgled this year? Are you nervous about this? And do you think it'll happen? And that's what the y-axis is. And across most countries, people overestimate whether they'll get burgled, right? But the thing you'll see straight away is, well, what explains some of these differences, I haven't put the graph as well, but it turns out it's not your actual victimization rate cross-nationally. What really makes a big deal is this social trust. So you see this bundle at the bottom, of course, there's the Scandinavians, and they're not at all worried about things like burglary. Actually, Denmark has quite high rates of burglary, but they're just not worried about it, right? Its meaning is different. Whereas for us, what's driving our fear isn't the objective risk of burglary, it's the fact that we're kind of afraid of other people, actually. So it becomes manifest in this way. Okay, so let's carry on. Is it all moral decline? So things that when you get into the value space, people think, oh, it's all, oh, God, going to the dogs or whatever. Of course, there's been quite a lot of value change. I've just brought together a number of OECD countries in this bundle for a second. And it shows you basically to what extent do you think the following things are acceptable, justifiable on a scale of 1 to 10. And I've ranked them by how much they've changed over the last 20 years. This is for a bundle of kind of OECD countries. So we know, for example, our attitude towards homosexuality at the top, we've become much more tolerant, not only in the UK, but in many countries. And as you kind of go down the list, you can see other things where, however, we haven't really changed very much. So look at these things about cheating on your taxes or lying in your own interest, etc. If anything, we've actually tended to get less tolerant of such behaviours over time. So it's certainly not a simple story of moral decline, generally, we see. And there's actually an underlying moral logic to most of these patterns of change. So, I think, anyway, if there's no obvious victim, or put it this way, if there is an obvious victim, we actually tend not to have got more tolerant. Whereas if it's something in the privacy of your own home, we generally got, in your own bedroom particularly, we're more relaxed about it over time. One of the things we do certainly know is that the underlying drivers of these values has changed. So it used to be, for example, if we knew your religious position, we could actually judge all kinds of other things about your values. Now, it turns out that most religious beliefs haven't declined very much. But what has changed, in other words, we all believe in God and whatever, a majority in almost every country, but it's not consequential anymore. So it used to be your religious beliefs would tell you all kinds of other things about your beliefs. This line, this rather complicated-looking graph, basically shows a whole load of countries, including the UK, what's happened to the relationship over 20 years between your religious values in a country and your other moral values, like the ones I just showed you. And you can see, with the exception of North America, in every case this relationship degrades over time. North America is very distinctively different in this respect, where it's become more consequential. So it's not religion that drives it anymore, that is not driving our ethics, if you like. But one of the, I think, fascinating stories, which goes to the herd metaphor, is that countries are getting less similar in their values. And that's something which certainly the people who set up the World Value Survey, etc., didn't expect to find. So this graph, which I want to show, again, is similar. The pale lines are how much has the attitude changed, again, across a number of countries. How much have we gotten more tolerant or less? So, for example, dislike of someone of a different ethnicity or religion, or the next one you can see down homosexuality. The pale line, we got much more relaxed about it. There's been a big change in our attitudes. But the blue line is the spread across countries. To what extent are countries similar or less? And you can see that in almost all of these examples, the one at the bottom, interesting exception, countries, this is just in OECD countries, have got less similar in terms of their attitudes on these values. So we're kind of going our own way in some ways. And in fact, if you look within countries, generally the story in the majority of countries is convergence of our values within. But even within the OECD, our values are coming apart, right? So if you go back to that value map, not only are we not converging, we're actually generally slightly diverging generally in our value patterns. The exception at the bottom, fortunately, given that's the case, is that teaching kids tolerance, where there's been some convergence across countries, we should teach them tolerance, which, given that there's divergence otherwise, is probably a good thing. So just one example, final, before we move on, to go back to social trust, which I think is always an interesting variable, which is diverged across countries. So just to give you a handle on this social trust question, we can play this game now if you would like. It's you just say, do you think, you can ask we can play this? Do you think most other people can be trusted? And the question is, would you say yes Or would you say, no, can't be too careful? So we just try it for a second. How many would say yes to that question? You see, look, I would say, look, that's got to be at least 90% in the room. That just shows you how weird a population you are. Because the UK is now at about 30%, right, in general. But of course, partly because it reflects your characteristics. You're professional and so on, and we'll see that in a second. And probably, in your lives, most people can be trusted, actually. But anyway, what I want to just say is that it's very consequential, this variable, and as you can see, just for a group of countries, that's been divergent. So the Swedes are getting more and more trusting of each other. They're nearly as trusting as you guys in this room. Whereas the French, you can see at the bottom, didn't trust each other much to start off with, and now, you know, enough said. Okay, so what I've tried to tell you is, in this story is that there's something very interesting that happened on value change, and actually these very distinctive national characteristics and footprints are actually, if anything, getting more distinctive over time. So this is just another take, so you see some UK data, and you see in this case, this is, again, compared to our European allies, and you can see we're just basically a bit authoritarian. We don't care so much for democracy, for example, solidarity, not so big. Rule of law, we like that quite a lot, and respect for human life. You know, these characteristics are likely to be very persistent, and they do seem to stick over time. And there's something that happens about our relationship to others, and we bump against each other in countries, and it certainly seems to be, as I said, national level, where we kind of mold each other and reinforce these characteristics. Now, the last twist of the story before we move on to the kind of implications of it all is this inequality bit of it. So, hidden wealth, is there an inequality, and what's the story? Well, just to touch on values for a moment, we have all become generally more meritocratic, and that's true across countries. This is an old question, and you ask people, you've got two secretaries, and one of them is a bit more productive than the other. Should the more productive one, I think it's like it's a younger, more productive one, should you get paid more? And now it's true, even in the early 80s, most countries, with the exception of Italy in the sample, actually said, yes, the harder working one should get paid more. And you can see the US well ahead. And then you can see in the majority of countries, we've gotten even more believing in that kind of story of that type of meritocracy. Although you might notice the UK in the middle, we move less than most. The exceptions, sorry if you can't read, are Argentina and Spain. But what we do know is that a lot of these characteristics, and I've just used social trust as an example, are very unevenly distributed. So we saw here in the room, you're all a very high trust group, and I've said to you that's pretty unusual. If we split that by social class groups, that's the kind of answer you get in the UK today. So professional is much more likely to say most other people can be trusted, whereas if you're unskilled or in a council estate or something, it will be roughly half that rate, 20-odd%. And this turns out to be very consequential, actually. It's a marker of lots of other things that drive what happens to you in life, about your networks and who you can trust, and lots of other characteristics, including your social skills and so on. I just thought I'd drop in this one on social mobility, since there's always a temptation of, and Matthew would have seen it too, ministers and politicians from across parties get very interested in mobility. And of course, one of the reasons why social mobility is as lower than you might otherwise expect is because of all these hidden characteristics in populations that aren't evenly distributed. But even within the UK, you can sort of get lessons for our own history on this. We'll all know the headline story. This is just, what you're saying is, what percentage of kids from the 1970 cohort ended up in professional groups? And actually, you can see it broken down by England, Wales, and Scotland for reasons I'll explain in a second. And so you see the pale blue line is, well, if you came from a professional background, you're much more likely to end up in a professional background for all kinds of reasons, all kinds of characteristics. Whereas those from routine occupations, which remember about a third of the population in that sample, a bit more even, much, much less likely. Well, in a crude sense, your mobility story is what's the ratio between those two things. But before I just turn that into numbers for you, you might note that it just so happens from the 1970 cohort, there was much bigger change in terms of the social class structure in Scotland than there was in England, for example. So England was already quite professionalised, essentially, whereas Scotland was much less so. So Scotland saw, over this period, a massive expansion, more room at the top, as Goldthorpe would say. And of course, we often hold that up as, well, that'd be wonderful if we could just do that, number one. And number two, would it be that it would be all those opportunities from those from more disadvantaged backgrounds? But the key thing, of course, is the ratio of what is it that the number of people from, if you're in a professional class as your backgrounds versus your routine, what's the ratio between the two? So you can see for England it's just under 6. For Wales, it'd be more like 10. For Scotland, where there was this massive expansion in the professional class, much more dramatic than in England, it's 12.3. So in other words, these opportunities are all completely taken up and dominated by the professional groups that already existed. And remember, of course, you start with a routine class group, which was even bigger. So again, a part of the story of hidden wealth. All right, well, what we can do about this, again, in a value base. This is, I think, to me, one of the most depressing graphs working through the book, which was, if you look across countries, and you say, well, what's the relationship between the actual inequality, is income inequality, and people's preparedness to do something about it? There was a lot of discussion, actually, in the recent British Social Attitudes results on this. One thing about the simple inequality questions, if you ask people, they always say, well, of course, I don't like inequality, although less now than they used to. But this is a trade-off question, and it basically says, on the one hand, do you think the income gap should even be bigger, for reasons of, for greater incentives, etc., or it should be smaller because, it's unfair or whatever. And this, of course, on the other axis, is the actual level of the ratio of income, top 20 to bottom 20. So, South American countries, incredibly high levels of inequality. There's the Anglo-Saxon cluster with the US at the top. The main point is there's no relationship at all. So people seem happy with where they're at, right? They're situated in this context, and we are too, of course. One asset, before we just finally move on to conclusions, but has become more evenly distributed is time, actually. And that's true across countries. So whereas professionals a generation ago used to spend, for my parents, well, my father didn't play golf, but if he did, he would spend a bit of time playing golf, and his plumber would be spending all his hours, working long hours. Whereas now I know that I can't get hold of my plumber because he does play golf, and I'm here doing a lecture, and you're listening to it. So, and that's actually something you see across class. We also just spend less time doing paid work, and that turns out, to me, one of the big opportunities is the level of time, actually, that we've got in a modern society. So less than a quarter of our waking time, if averaged across a population of over 18s, including weekends, is spent in paid work. Policy implications of all this. So I've tried to plug a bit of a gap, I think, in some of what Matthew was talking about in his lecture, which is something in between the very individual cognitive effects and quite distant democratic institutions, about the kind of the paths that we're on and the values that we're locked into, often in societies, and how actually this has a very powerful influence on us as we bump against each other. And I've tried to at least give some sense of this underlying story of this, in many ways, it's a positive characteristics about how we relate to each other. What are the kind of things I think we end up with? Well, a big thing for me is this, I realize I've hardly touched on it, but what I call actually Avner Offer calls the economy of regard. So a huge amount of our time and a huge driver of our underlying well-being is not the real economy, but about the kind of care-based transactions that we're engaged in everyday life. You're looking after your kids, looking after elderly, talking to your friends, whatever it might be. A lot of our lives actually are spent doing that kind of thing. If we do such a crude thing as to monetarize it, let's say, how much would it cost to pay somebody a minimum wage to do some of those things like looking after our kids, it's more than GDP per capita. So it's not like a small thing. And one of the things I think is wrong with our general accounts, which is partly this Danish story, is that we just systematically underestimate the value of these informal care-based exchanges. The good news is there's plenty of evidence from elsewhere that you can do things to facilitate it. So I'll at least just give you one example of a kind of complementary currency. So in Japan, which of course has much more advanced demographics than we do, and one of the things they have had for a long time is they have these care credit system, the Kira Kipu system. So if I can't look after my elderly parents, because they're 500 miles away, I'll look after somebody else's elderly parents, and I get these care credits which I transfer to them. An important characteristic is it's actually based on reciprocity. So increase the total level of activity, and the care that is received by my parents is experienced very differently than paid care. But it catalyzes the total level of activity. To me, that's a better model, actually, than, again, Matthew in his lecture referred a lot to altruism. It's a model rooted actually in reciprocity rather than pure pure altruism. And it's one of the ways of fostering or oiling some of this kind of hidden wealth and transactional stuff. I'll go through this a bit more swiftly. But citizen consumer information as a public good, I think, is a big neglected area. One of the things that, if you like, the everyday example of it is TripAdvisor. But actually, we can do it in many other areas. The information which we've got, and if we can pass it on to other citizens, it's got strong public good aspects. We can do a lot more about it. And indeed, if you're into the post-bureaucratic state, it's the kind of thing you probably want to get into in a pretty big way. Partly my story, of course, is one about how you want to broaden the attacks on inequality, certainly in relation to social capital and other such aspects, as well as other things. I know you had David Willits, but capital, the distribution of capital in society is one of the things you can have a go on to. There are a load of things, I'm not going to dwell on them, a lot to do with my day job these days, about policy and governance, about applying evidence-based policy, celebrating small failures. I haven't talked about it in a lot of detail. Behavioral economics, yeah, I think it's great stuff, as long as you get the permission of the public to do this kind of thing. A big part of the story. I'm big, like on Matthew, on democratic innovations. I think they're a very powerful way of harnessing some of this stuff, not least on the value bit. If you decide this value story is a big part of the story, what you kind of want citizens to do is just talk to each other and figure out, well, what is it that we should be doing? What is the way to go on in a society? And even if it doesn't go any further to government, it's a message to each other about what's acceptable social norms. And, well, again, that's my day job, fixing government. But I thought I'd just conclude on this last thing, which is, I mean, many of you come to these lectures, wonderful lectures, I'm sure, at RSA, and you hear, I mean, either a very interesting intellectual story or one about what government should do different. An interesting question is, what else could we do ourselves that would be different? I thought I'd just choose a couple of examples. So one thing is, a fascinating question in an altogether pretty secular society like the UK is, what is it that we do to figure out our ethics and work out how we get on with each other? And what is it that, I mean, clearly religions did lots of things like celebrate major life events as well as justify ethical values and so on. And having Parliament debate it isn't quite the same, I think. So I think the kind of thing you might imagine you would do is you'd say, well, okay, we may do it already, but let's figure out 10 friends, 10 couples, families, whatever, and we'll get together once a week, once a month, and we'll talk about some important ethical issue, and we'll mark life events and so on. And actually, that's the kind of thing you'd want to do. That's exactly the kind of thing you'd want to do. And it would change who we are, of course, and it would and actually probably make us a lot happier, of course. Micro-welfare, I mean, one of the stories I get onto in the book in a big way is what I call affiliative welfare. If we don't want to do lots more redistribution, but we don't want laissez-faire, is there anything in between? Well, I think one of the things you do is you do forms of essentially micro-welfare. So you get people to help each other in various ways. So I'll give you one example. I think it's a neat one. If, when you're writing your will, instead of giving your assets to your kids, you put them in a descendants trust, which seems like, isn't that the kind of thing that Rothschild would do, whatever. But actually, lots of us could do that. It turns out to be a very progressive thing to do, right? If you put your assets, instead of just giving to your kids who are already in their 50s or whatever, they're probably fine, and their income will be pretty similar to yours. But every generation, of course, that relationship tends to degrade, actually quite a lot. So if you think about your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, many of them will look more and more like the general population. So if you take your house, or a chunk of your house value, and you stick it into a descendants trust, let's suppose a third of the population did that, easily could do. Well, just if that third did it, you get better than 80% coverage of the great-grandchildren would have an endowment that would come to them. So it'd be an example of micro-welfare. It's not as attractive as a perfectly rational Weberian welfare state, but it's actually a lot better than laissez-faire. And the last one, of course, is we want to be a bit more Danish, I suppose. Well, I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Nicola.